The views expressed on this program are those of the producers and individuals appearing on this program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Sun Prairie Media Center staff, its video service providers, or the staff and elected officials of the City of Sun Prairie.
Hey everyone, this is Rose Daly, the City Sustainability Coordinator of Sun Prairie, and you're listening to the Sustainable Sun Prairie podcast, the show that aspires to educate, empower, and engage our listeners in all aspects of sustainability. Whether you are a seasoned sustainability enthusiast or just beginning your sustainability journey, each episode will have something new and exciting for everyone. Let's begin the conversation for a greener community. Hey everyone, happy Earth Day. Earth Day is personally my favorite day of the year because it gives us a chance to honor and celebrate our beautiful Earth. To celebrate this year, we are bringing you a bonus episode of Sustainable Sun Prairie that is focused on pollinator conservation. Pollinators are often associated with Earth Day because this is a time when we clean up our local parks, plant new trees and flowering species, and overall create a healthier environment for us and for our native pollinators. So as a gift to you, we are going to provide you with a full toolkit of resources and knowledge that will empower you to transform your yard into a pollinator paradise. And it's so important that we focus on taking actions in our own yards because native pollinator species are declining rapidly due to urbanization, habitat destruction, and the use of pesticides. However, we as individuals can work to protect them by creating safe, friendly spaces in our own yards that provide food, water, and shelter to our native pollinators. So let's jump right into our episode. I have here with me today Cindy Bertley, who serves as the Parks and Forestry Director for the City of Sun Prairie. She is an expert on pollinators and native plantings for yards. Welcome, Cindy. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm currently the Parks and Forestry Director for the city. I've been here for almost 3 years now. My background, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Forest Ecosystem Restoration and Management from Stevens Point, a couple minors, and I worked for a little bit, and then I went back to get my master's degree in Environmental Science and Policy at Green Bay. My research there really focused on temperate forest growth dynamics in northern Wisconsin. So I've lived and worked in many different states. I'm originally from Wisconsin, and currently with my role here at the city, I split my time between the city's parks and the trees, and my true passion is field ecology, which basically means I love being outside and I love knowing everything about, what I see outside, but I'm really drawn to plants, and so that kind of is what really drives me, and I really love restoration ecology, so bringing natural landscapes back to life.
Oh, I love that. That is so cool. Also, can I just point out your hoodie? Anyone who is just listening to us, Cindy has on the best hoodie. It is covered in butterfly species, so it's perfect for today's episode. Where did you get that, by the way?
Oh, I got it as a gift from my husband, and I kind of figured, well, if I'm talking about pollinators, I might as well, look the part. So.
Oh, yes, dressed for the occasion.
Yes.
We love that. What specifically drew you to pollinator ecology?
So yeah, it's kind of been a natural progression of my passion for ecology and plants and kind of where I went with my career line. I didn't initially learn a lot about pollinators, but several years ago, I guess at this point, when a whole bunch of bees were dying at extreme rates, and they kind of came on the news, and they didn't really know at the time why. In my day-to-day life and my different jobs throughout the point, it started becoming, a regular talking point and hot topic, and it was at a lot of conferences. And so when pollinators and insect ecology were starting to be talked about more, I started paying a lot more attention as I was out there looking at trees and plants. I was paying a lot more attention to what was visiting those plants and trees. And now with my own gardens at my own house, it really is a highlight of my day when I get to go and check on my plants. And then I also get to watch all the different pollinators that are buzzing around my lot and try to learn where they're going, what they're doing. I consider myself very lucky to have a job working for the city that's directly related to all my passions. I get to directly impact public land and natural resources here in the city that affect our local and regional pollinators. And I think it's so important. And there is a lot, just that the average person can do. So.
Yeah, I think sometimes we end up taking nature for granted. We just, it just exists in front of us, and we just think to ourselves, nature will figure itself out. We kind of feel disconnected from it, and we don't understand how our actions impact even our own local environment in our yard. So I love that you took a personal interest in taking a deep dive into the connections we have with nature and how everything interacts symbiotically. So could you tell us a little bit more about some actions that our city has taken to help with pollinator conservation?
Sure. So since I started, which again is not coming up on 3 years in like 2 weeks, it's a lot of time and no time all at once. We have worked on installing a lot of pollinator gardens throughout the city on public land. We've worked with several volunteers and volunteer groups, such as the Sun Prairie Park Friends. And we now have, I think we have 19 separate gardens and growing that are planted with native plants, specifically for pollinator habitat throughout the city. And like I said, and it's growing every year. We're adding a few more. And so in addition to planting specific gardens, we're also doing several things to help pollinators, which we'll kind of talk about a little bit later. But this includes like waiting to clean up these gardens until the spring, reducing our use of herbicide and being very strategic and targeted when we do need to use them. Identifying areas throughout our park system that could host prairie restorations or meadows or low mow zones, and reintroducing prescribed fire to certain areas. We have one prescribed fire planned for this spring for the library and also a small area in Sheehan Park. I've been told it was planted several years ago with wildflowers, and just over the years, woody species have kind of grown in. And so this last few weeks, we've been working with the Sun Prairie Park Friends and other volunteers to remove the shrubs and transplant some of the seedlings out of the area so that we can burn it. So it's really exciting to kind of get to do all of these things.
That is very exciting. I like how there's a lot of different kind of smaller things that we're doing that are making a big impact in our city. What are the sizes of our pollinator gardens? Are they pretty big?
Right now, I would say they're pretty small. Like our biggest ones are at City Hall, the West Side Community Services Building, and we just installed one last fall at Stone Ridge Estates Park in kind of one of the parking medians. So again, we were kind of starting small. This is new territory. We kind of had limited resources, and we're installing them in pretty highly landscaped areas, so kind of seeing how they go early on and the kind of maintenance we need. So right now, pretty small, but I think that's a really important part to kind of understand about urban ecology and the impact you can have with small areas is really, if you build it, they will come. All you need is just a few plants. And I continue to be amazed. We've planted, over at the West Side building, there's just kind of 2 parking medians that we have put native plant plugs in, and right away, I would say the week after I planted, there was monarch butterflies visiting the plants.
Wow.
So they don't really have to be that big to make a big impact. And hopefully in the future, especially this year with the prescribed burn, that area, I think it's maybe a half an acre or an acre. And then again, with the library prairies to kind of restoring those are much bigger areas that'll make a bigger impact. So in the future, we hope to do bigger areas. We're just kind of slowly growing our capacity. So
okay, awesome. And off air, you had mentioned that you had even seen toads inside our gardens, which I think demonstrates that we have a full ecosystem in these small areas.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the things I continue to get surprised about is last year we put this really small garden. I'd say it's 10 feet by 8 feet over at Fox Point with some volunteers. And so there's wood chips and plants. And I went back to check on it a few weeks later, and there was an American toad just hiding in the wood chips. And that's really amazing because it just came and it used that area to kind of cool down in the heat of summer in that park. There's, 2 kind of large stormwater ponds, and it just shows, like you said, how many other things also use it. So
right, because we think gardens, so we think pollinators, getting nectar and pollen. But then these areas also provide shade, like you mentioned, and moisture, and a little tiny ecosystem for probably critters down in the ground, things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also know our city does No Mow May. We are approaching the month of May, so that program will be starting here pretty soon. Do our parks do anything related to No Mow May?
Yeah, so each year since we've started, which was, just a few years ago, we've identified strategic areas in city parks where we could implement these practices. And we'll do so again this year. And we consider these areas very carefully so that we're able to maintain and manage the existing recreational areas in our parks and consider the impact on our staff and on our equipment. And I think kind of when we were talking about the toad, a good example is we didn't know until we started it, how it would work, what that really means from an operational standpoint, and also the impact it has. And the first year we did it at Sheehan, many of you know or have used the sledding hill at Sheehan Park. So that was one of the very small local spots that we chose not to mow for the month of May. And one of our parks crew had sent me a picture, like towards middle to late May, that there was this fawn that was hiding in the tall grass on the sledding hill. So it was so cool. And again, like, just it kind of shows if you build it, they will come. There's all sorts of things that we're doing on a regular basis that we really don't think much of. And when you change those practices, things change. So
right.
Yeah.
Wow. So just letting our grass grow for a month could bring in an entirely new, like, set of wildlife.
Yeah,
Wow.
exactly. Especially in an urban setting, you know, these animals are here and they're adapting to us, and so I think they pay attention a lot more than we think we do. So when we do change things, I think they kind of take the opportunity to be like, oh, okay, I'll use this spot. So
Right. They're just like waiting for us to like give them resources or create spaces for them. And they will, like you said, they will come, they will take advantage of that.
Yeah, definitely.
So I really love everything the city is doing to help pollinators and to help wildlife. You guys are killing it. It's great. But now let's transition our focus to actions we as individuals can take. Because the main goal of this episode is to empower community members with knowledge and resources they need to make their own yards a place that not only conserves pollinators, but allows them to thrive. Now, I think often that when people hear the words pollinator conservation, the first thing they think of are flowers because they serve as food sources to pollinators. What is the best way to incorporate flowering resources into our yards for pollinators? And are there some flowering plants that are better for pollinators than others?
Yeah, so if you have a residential lot in an urban area, or even kind of just even with a small green space, you likely already have a lot of plants in your yard that do flower and are for pollinators. I think a good example is your grass. A lot of people don't think about flowers with grass, and if you let your grass grow tall enough, it does flower, and it does produce pollen, which can be a benefit to pollinators. So whether your plants are native or ornamental, they can provide resources to pollinators. And kind of like you said, one of the biggest things that pollinators are looking for are flowers to begin with, and because flowers have nectar for energy and pollen for protein. And not all plants have either, and not all plants have both, especially when we start talking about ornamentals and hybridized plants. I think it's important to know that those plants are specifically selected or specifically bred by humans for very specific, like human-centric traits, like color, size, maintenance, disease, to be thornless or all sorts of other things. And when they start manipulating genetics, then that can change the plant in a significant way that may or may not provide those resources to the insects and pollinators that use that plant. So I think it's important to kind of pay attention to that. And like when it comes to natives, it's really important that like when you can try to add those, especially when it's like native to the Midwest or native to Wisconsin. Insects have evolved with plants over a very, very, very long period of time. And so those interactions are really important. And so like a lot of times certain insects and certain pollinators are only able to use like a very specific plant or different plant types. And so as we start to change out our native plants with ornamentals or other hybrids, that can significantly affect, our native pollinators or our native insects. And so like when we're talking about hybridized plants, a lot of times through that process, it may eliminate the pollen or it may eliminate viable seeds from that plant. And those are things that insects and birds and other wildlife really, kind of rely on when it comes to plants. And I think, too, when you're thinking kind of native or ornamental, when you go to a nursery, it can be very overwhelming. Some of the labeling, it's just like at grocery stores, with the very misleading or kind of marketing buzzwords. When you go to a nursery to buy a plant, there's all sorts of labels on there that make you think, oh, this could be really good, but it can be kind of misleading. For example, like you go to a nursery and you see the word perennial on a label, which means it can survive year after year. And as somebody who's just starting their garden, they don't want to plant every year the same plant. So perennials are a really good target. But what I would add is when you see the word perennial, look at what zone it's for, because sometimes at nurseries, it'll say perennial, but then it's perennial for zone 7. And that means it won't be perennial here in Sun Prairie. We're in zone 5, which is a little bit colder. And so they kind of, like, the stores are relying on you to know that, but that can be like I said, really, really challenging as a gardener or as somebody who's just first starting to get into that. They're like, hey, I bought this plant and it said it was perennial, but it didn't come back to life. And that is one of the reasons. So I would just kind of pay attention to that labeling and what it's saying. And just like, if you can, try to use some natives. I think now as you kind of go through every year, when I go to different nurseries, the native plant section is growing.
Good.
And like more stores are offering it. I think people are asking for it more. And so I'm starting to see that quite a bit. So that's like really encouraging. I think some of the places you can go nearby to get native plants, even right here in Sun Prairie, you can go to Jung's Garden. There's White Pelican Farms in Wyacina, the Plant Dane program, which is hosted by the county, where you can order native plants at a very reasonable rate. There's Bruce and Company, which is in Middleton, and in kind of an infinite number of sources online where you can order native plants. Some big ones in our area are Prairie Nursery and Prairie Moon Nursery, and those are really cool because you can order like kits of plants that are already like have a certain types of species. So you just have to pick like, oh, I want the butterfly kit or the pollinator kit or the wet meadow pick. And then oftentimes, too, they give you kind of a diagram with the species already laid out. So it's just kind of removes a lot of the decisions that they kind of do it for you.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So maybe like a beginner might want to invest in one of those like packages that come with everything you need, instructions to lay it out. And I'm assuming on the websites they let you like filter by your geographical location. That way you wouldn't fall into that trap of this is perennial but only in zone 7 sort of thing.
Yeah, I think like especially when you're looking for native plants and you find some of these nurseries that specialize in it, they're always really good about like highlighting the areas that these and the sites that these plants would be good for. When you start getting into the bigger seed companies and the bigger nurseries, then it's a little more challenging, but just like online as in your labels, like they have it. So once you know some of the things to kind of look out for, you can kind of avoid those. But in general, I would say if you're looking at native plants to Wisconsin and you're at Prairie Nursery or Prairie Moon Nursery, all the plants coming out of there are really good, and they would do very well here in Wisconsin. So.
Okay, great. So it sounds like not all flowering species are on a level playing field. The natives will provide higher levels of nutrients to our pollinators, but ornamentals can also provide nutrients. So maybe the takeaway here is to have a diverse set of flowering species in your yard. Ornamental if you love the aesthetic look of them, and then the natives, which will provide that like really balanced diet for the pollinators.
Yeah, I think so. And, everybody is kind of a little bit different in their aesthetic and what they're looking for. And early on, even as myself, as like, going to school this for many years and doing this for my career, I was really focused on, I only want natives. I only want to do this. But then there's this flower and it's really cool, and I really like tulips and some of this other stuff. And so I think I've come up with my own self, just kind of being just really flexible with yourself and trying different things and what works for your yard and what you like, and trying not to be too hard on yourself if you're not planting 100% natives. I think starting small and just having a few like native species, a good one to start with is Black-Eyed Susan. You can find that almost anywhere. And just seeing how it is. And like I said earlier, like the native plants, the native insects are the ones that know how to use those and use those readily. And so, and I would challenge everybody to kind of keep an eye on that stuff in their yard to see the difference on what visits, the ornamentals in your yard versus the natives, and really see. So it's really fun, I think, to kind of find what your niche is and what you like the most and just kind of go with that. Try not to be too hard on yourself on following really, really strict rules.
Yeah, and we do talk about that a lot in the show, is like, don't feel pressure to be perfect, because that will just slow you down and discourage you. Mm-hmm. So no matter what you're focusing on, whether it's pollinators, fast fashion, transportation, your energy use, just like do what you can now and then do more when you're able to, and you will be making a positive impact.
Yeah, definitely.
So typically whenever I see pollinator gardens in people's yards, they have like a concentrated area where they say, this is my pollinator garden. All of my native species are in this area. Would you say that it's better to have that kind of like concentrated garden, or to kind of have these flowers distributed throughout your yard? Is there one option that's better?
Yeah, I think both are great. Again, I always side on what's the best option for you, what you like the most and what you want to see out of your green space. is if you want to spread it around your area or just kind of have a concentrated spot. I would say if this is your first time trying native plants or specifically planting for pollinators, it might be a little bit easier for you to start with a small garden or specific area and then kind of learn through trial and error, as every gardener does every year, because there's different weather and different diseases and different pests that happen every year. Just to kind of start small and then learn from that and kind of go from there. It might be easier. I think the bigger thing here to focus on, instead of like, small area, big area, diffuse, concentrated, is with pollinators. The biggest thing is you can provide, resources for them throughout the entire year. So thinking early in the season and all the way through kind of late fall. If you always have something flowering in your yard, pollinators will start to know that, and they'll just rely on your yard as a refuge area because they know that they can find something good, in your yard to use. And not only is that great for pollinators and wildlife, but also from an aesthetic standpoint, always having something blooming in your yard is really great.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really good to know. So prioritize having flowers like basically April to October.
Yeah, I think that's more of what I would focus on early on is kind of going through that whole spread, because you'll get a lot more than if you just focus on, this small area or all your yard. So,
okay, love that. So you had mentioned that the native flowers are the better choice at helping our native pollinators because they provide that more diverse and high quality food source. Do you have a few native species that you would recommend?
So how long do we have to talk about plants? I'll try not to bore you too much. I love plants, like I said before, so I usually have to kind of check myself in the conversation. But I can mention a few species that you can look for in your local nursery for each season. So like kind of said before, there's that early, which is like April, May, the mid-season, which is the June, July, August. This is like the height of summer. You'll have the most options. A lot of things are flowering, at that time. And then the late season is more your September, October kind of fall time frame. And so when we're talking early, that's like wild lupin, which is a purple flower, and smooth penstemon, which is has a white flower. It's also known as foxglove beard tongue. Those are some good ones to look at. They're pretty easy to find for your early season. And then when you're looking at the mid season, bee balm or wild bergamot or monarda is a really great one. It definitely lives up to its name as bee balm. That everything loves it. Black-eyed Susan. There's butterfly milkweed, which is the orange one. Purple coneflower and blazing star. Like I said, there's quite a number of options that you can hit, and on all the ones that I just mentioned, you can find really easily. And then when you get towards fall, again, as kind of a lot of the pollinators, just like birds, a lot of them migrate or they kind of store up for winter, and so they're looking for certain species that can really give them the biggest bang for their buck. And so when you're driving down the road in the fall, you see a lot of yellows and purples, and a lot of times those yellows, that's goldenrod. And so in Wisconsin, we have all sorts of native, I think we have like 60 species of goldenrod, and some of the best ones to use for your garden are stiff goldenrod and showy goldenrod. I will say that while goldenrod is a really great plant and native, it can take over your yard. It can take over your garden. So like really focusing on the ones that are good for an urban setting. Like I said, stiff and showy goldenrod are really great. And then, for the asters, the fall asters, I would look for New England aster and smooth blue aster. Those are really great plants, and there's not much you need to do to them for them to thrive. And I think New England aster is the one that stays flowering through the latest part in September, which is really important for monarchs and other sorts of insects that are storing up for the winter. So
okay, this is very interesting. I've definitely seen a lot of these species before. We added them to our previous garden. So I just love seeing this breakdown of like early, mid, and late season for these. So choosing like at least one from each category will create a great habitat for pollinators through the growing season.
Yeah, I think when I've seen stuff, trying to focus on each kind of blooming period throughout the season, and then having maybe a couple of each. So if you want one species, maybe having 3 of each one to start with, so that you have more than one thing. So like I said, so always have something there for the pollinators.
Okay, got it. The golden rule. So let's say we've chosen the location in our yard for our garden and we've selected our plant species. We went out to buy them and now we're assembling our garden. So I know typically in standard gardens, flower gardens, people like to put down like plastics or geotextiles over the ground for various reasons, like to control weeds, for example. So are there any best practices regarding ground covers and mulch in a pollinator garden?
Yeah, so I think this kind of plays again into what you're looking for in your garden and what you've done in the past, and what you've heard others do, and like what the look that you're going for. Do you want your garden to be more of a prairie or meadow, like that wildflower look, or do you want it to be more a traditional landscape bed? Either way, I would, instead of using plastics or landscape fabric to minimize weed, I'd focus heavily on mulching the bare ground. So anywhere you have open soil or open bare ground, plants want to grow there. Any seeds that come in, whether they're in the seed bank or they fly in on the wind, if you have bare ground, they're going to grow there. So I would try to cover that bare ground with mulch, like wood chips or straw or some other organic material. And this has a whole sorts of benefits, like it moderates soil temperature, holds on to moisture. It adds organic matter over time to the soil, which, kind of helps that ecosystem there. And then it also allows the plant to naturally spread, whereas some of those, the fabrics and the plastics, it really constricts the growth of what your plants can do. And kind of to add on to that with those unnatural barriers that you put on top of the soil, to prevent weeds. It may seem really nice and clean to kind of keep things manicured, but what I've learned over the years about nature is that it doesn't like to play by our rules, and it doesn't like to be controlled, and it will always find a way to do what it has always done. And so those fabrics and plastics, they create a barrier, for plants and organisms and kind of the different things. And so, like, I'd also add that weeds, they don't need a ton of soil to grow, and a lot of times you put in this fabric and this plastic, and guess what? The weeds grow on top of that.
Wow.
And so now
you can't win.
No, it's really challenging, and then you have a real mess, because as over time, those plastics and fabric, they start to degrade, and then they get mixed in with your soil and your mulch and your plants, and it's all sorts of things. So what I would say is kind of the best defense against weeds is to provide an environment or create an environment for the plants that you like that can outcompete the weeds. So they'll do the work for you, and over time, you might as well save yourself a bunch of money on those fabrics and the plastic and just go with organic mulch. Like I said, it really, it actually benefits your soil over time, and allows the plants to kind of grow to their fullest potential. And if you're actually trying to start your garden by seed, this landscape fabric and plastic really won't allow you to do that. It doesn't allow the soil to contact the seeds that need to germinate. And even if they do germinate, if you have a barrier, they're not going to be able to grow through that. So it really limits the potential of what your garden can be, and it creates a whole bunch of work later on if you decide, now I want to take this out, and that's a whole nother effort. So.
Right, very true. So we like the idea of a ground cover, but we want it to be natural.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So I've seen both seeds, seedlings, and mature native plants be added to gardens. Is there one you would recommend using to start a pollinator garden?
So again, this kind of depends on you, and the biggest things really to consider are the size of the area you want to plant and how long you're willing to wait to see the look that you're going for, to see the impact. Generally, more mature plants, they're more expensive, but they make the quickest impact, and then vice versa. The cheapest option is seeds, but you have to wait kind of a long time for some, for the plant to reach maturity and maybe see the look that you want to see. And also with seeds, one of the challenging things is it may be hard early on to tell the difference between a weed and then what you're actually planting on purpose.
Right.
So it's a great option, but if you don't want to wait that long, then I would kind of start to aim more. This kind of perfect sweet spot is to purchase plugs, which think of kind of those plastic trays that you see of native plants in the spring. You can get these from many places, including the Plant Dane program. They are more moderate cost. The plants are usually a couple inches tall. And so when you plant them, one, you get the impact of seeing it right away, and also you see the plant. So if weeds start to grow around it, then it's a lot easier for you to know, that's a weed, I got to pick that. And really, even though it's a plug that looks pretty small, like in one growing season, if you have the right conditions, they can really take off. Like, for example, last year with our City Hall garden that you can see at the southwest corner of City Hall, we planted that in May with plugs. And like we had several that were flowering the first year, and there was several butterflies on them the first year. And so, yeah, you can really do a big impact just by getting some of the right stuff. And you don't have to spend a ton of money either. And like I said, after the first year, by year 2, the plants are really thriving. So
that's great. So it sounds like the seedlings or plugs are the most economic option and also the easiest for establishing in your garden. But if you wanted a bit more of a challenge, you could start from the seeds.
Yeah, definitely. Like I was saying before, is like it can be a very flexible approach, but this sweet spot with plugs. There's not a lot of work, moderate cost, and you kind of see a really immediate impact.
Okay, awesome. Can you tell us a bit more about what we can expect maintenance to look like in a pollinator garden, both the like short-term regular maintenance like weeding and watering, as well as the annual maintenance?
Yeah, so with annual maintenance, I think people think, oh, it's going to be a lot of work. And with natives, over time, it really is less work. Once it's established, they don't require a ton. They've been here a lot longer than we have without our help. So that's kind of what happens. Like the first year or two, like I said, depending on if you start with seeds or plants, the biggest thing to keep an eye on or to do is watering and weeding. Water at least once a week if we're not getting about an inch of rain a week, and then weeding to reduce the competition with your plants. And so then like year 2, 3 and beyond, it really is just kind of weeding early in the growing season just to make sure your natives are going to be the one that gets the head start, and then likely splitting plants, because by then they're going to be doing so well and so happy that they're probably going to be getting closer to each other or crowding out your favorite plant in the corner. So and then you can share your plants with your neighbors or your friends, or move them to different areas in your yard without spending any money. So that's even better.
Okay, so these native plants, they've really, like, that's the beauty of them, is they are made to grow in this area. So it's easier to maintain them over time, unlike having like ornamental or tropical plants in your yard that are probably a bit more fussy and require more of that regular maintenance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, and kind of how you said it is perfect, because since our native plants are adapted to our climate and to our soil, this is what they're used to. So they don't need a lot of hand holding. These other plants that you can get that are not native to our area, that's why they're not native here, is they don't do well here. So if you have these plants, it takes a lot more time and effort and resources for them to be able to survive and thrive, because this is not the environment they're used to. Mm-hmm. In addition, with native plants, a really important thing is to kind of know the site, know your kind of the local microclimate you have in your backyard where you're putting the plants, because native plants will actually be able to survive in areas with little to no maintenance that are really challenging. So kind of think super wet or super dry or really shady. There are specific species that really thrive in those. And so when you know ahead of time, or you start to see that, like say you plant it and you didn't realize, oh man, it floods, every spring because it's right next to the gutter, and I didn't think about that. When you go to get certain plants, look for the ones that are really adapted to wet areas, or if you have like a really dry area, get the plants that are, adapted to droughts or to dry prairies. They've adapted to live in those areas. So if you have that in your yard, that's perfect. That's what they're looking for. And I think another thing that I've learned probably every year in my garden is that there are certain plants I really love that I see out in nature, and I'm like, I want to grow that right in my yard because I want to see it every day. But what I have learned is there are certain plants of those that just don't like my yard. They just don't have the right microclimate for them to thrive. Even though I've tried planting them every year, they just don't work. And so I think you just have to learn the lesson that, well, this just is not the right spot, and there's a lot of plants that really do like my yard, so why don't I go with those and try to encourage those. And so kind of with natives, that's kind of the stuff that I kind of focus on. And then from a maintenance standpoint, a lot of people think about burning and that they need to burn or they need to have a fire for their native plants, and that's not necessarily the case. And it can be really challenging in an urban setting. The City of Sun Prairie does require burn permits, so if you wanted to burn, you would have to go through that process. And like I said, you don't have to burn to maintain your native plants. One of the things that burning does is reduce all that biomass, all that above ground biomass of the plants. So then it allows kind of an opening for plants to kind of come in. And you can mimic this process using like a weed whip or a brush cutter or hand tools to kind of remove that vegetation to allow other plants to grow. Like I said, it's not a perfect process, and if you walk in nature, it's not a perfectly clean process either. And those plants, they grow through a lot of duff and a lot of litter anyway, so you don't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be clean. Plants will find a way. But one of the things I do every spring, because most of my plants are directly adjacent to my house, so I can't burn, is I cut down the plants pretty close to the ground with this kind of sickle type thing, or I have used like hedge shears or hedge trimmers to kind of cut the plants close to the ground in the spring. And then like something that I haven't found yet is like, what do you do with all these dried stems, all these really tall dried stems in the spring? I'm still looking for, in my own kind of garden and my own practices, is the best way to deal with those. I haven't quite found the best tool, but I will say that the city does remove yard waste in bags at certain times of the year. So that's really helpful, you know, if you have a small urban lot, if you're coming up with a lot of this organic matter that you just can't process or compost in your yard because of, you know, what you have going on. That's a good option. And then to add to that, mowing is a really great option. So if you have your plants, like if you have the plants throughout your yard or more prairie or meadow type setting, you can eliminate biomass by mowing. If I did this, I would set my mower to the highest height, do it in spring. Same kind of thing as just you remove, you know, kind of that thick cover on the ground. If there's too much, just kind of disperse it throughout. But again, it really doesn't have to be that, you know, that challenging or that time intensive. It just kind of depends. So we're just kind of mimicking what goes on in nature.
Gotcha. Okay. Because I feel like for us as humans, it almost seems counterintuitive for us to like cut back our beautiful gardens or like burn them or mow them down. But it's something that our native plants need in this area to keep thriving in future years. Mm-hmm. Can you provide any insight on what we can expect to see as our pollinator gardens establish?
Yeah, I think that's like this is new territory for a lot of people. You know, they've grown the same thing for many years in their yard, and they know what to expect. And then they're just trying natives for the first time or pollinator friendly plants. They don't know what to expect. And so, with the native plants, one of the biggest things is that it takes time. You have to be patient. If you're using native plants, the first year or two, they're spending a lot of time growing deep roots, which is really great for a lot of things, kind of with the soil and the water retention, water purification, and all the organisms underground and all that stuff. So they're spending a ton of time the first 1, 2, 3 years growing deep roots. So you don't see a lot going on above ground, and it may make you think, oh no, it's not doing well. But again, just, you know, try to have some patience and let it do what it's going to do. I think I was telling you before about common milkweed. This is one I've learned in my own trial and errors. In my yard, I didn't have any common milkweed. And when I had just started, I didn't have a ton of money. And so I started a ton of stuff by seed, including common milkweed. And common milkweed is one of those that you see in old fields along the highways and all that stuff. And it's growing in really dense thicket of grass and other stuff. And it's 3, 4, 5 feet tall. And then in my yard, so I'm seeding it in my yard, and the first year is like 6 or 8 inches. Like, okay, it got there. That's cool. The second year, still that big. And I was like, wow, really? Third year, still didn't really grow that much. And I was like, man, what is going on? How is it not growing here? But I see it across the street from my house growing in this, this meadow and competing with all sorts of other stuff. And then, the following year, I found out why, and then it really came out of the ground. You could tell it was coming out of the ground really strong. It's because those first couple years, it was literally growing this giant taproot. Like they can have taproots up to 30 feet that are parallel in your ground, and then they shoot plants everywhere off of that root.
Wow. And so this could really spread through your whole
Oh,
yard.
Yeah. So like common milkweed is great for monarchs, and like just in general, milkweed is a really great plant for all sorts of insects. But in your urban lot, I would steer you more towards butterfly milkweed, which is the orange one. That one it grows a little more traditionally, like kind of just in clumps instead of shooting runners everywhere. So that was one try. I still have common milkweed in my yard, and I still let it grow, but I do kind of pull it and cut it in certain areas, but because it has that 30-foot taproot, it just keeps growing. It's very happy.
Right. It's probably going to be so hard to get rid of if you ever wanted to completely eliminate it.
Yeah, I think that's why they have the word, the weed is a part of it. So,
right.
But again, a really great plant. It's just one of those lesson learns in an urban setting. If you want to put milkweed in your yard, I'd aim more towards butterfly weed than milkweed.
Okay, good to know. And thank you for doing that experiment for the rest of us so we know to avoid it.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to talk about the height of these plants. And you kind of were alluding to this when you were talking about the common milkweed. But I have a friend who recently planted a pollinator garden right next to her walking path up to her house because, like, the idea of that is really pretty to have native species and pollinators right there as you're walking. But then I saw her garden, and after like a year or two, all the plants were like 5 feet tall, and they were just falling over the walkway. So can you tell us a little bit more about what we can expect in terms of the height of the plants and how we can effectively manage it?
Yeah, I think that's something to pay attention to when you're looking for certain plants is what is its mature height. And you may not believe it in the nursery when it's 2 inches tall that it says, 5, 6, 7, 8 feet tall. You're like, no way. And it's like, well, if it's in a good spot, it's definitely going to get that tall. And so from like a landscape design, landscape planning, I would incorporate that into your plan. So like trying to keep the taller plants towards the back and not in front of your shorter plants. If you have a prairie or wildflower type setting, I wouldn't worry about height too much, but kind of just like you said, picking certain areas in your yard. If you do have a tall plant and they get too tall for you, and especially in an urban setting, a lot of times those flowers can get really top heavy because they're really happy for other reasons, but now they're 6 feet tall and they're falling into your pathway, not letting your mail carrier get to your front door, which is my problem. So what I would do in that instance, and in summer and in winter, so like in summer, you have kind of the summer rains and summer winds and all that stuff. So it can kind of have these plants flop around. What I do is I get bamboo stakes, which you can get almost anywhere, and then I tie up the plants so they kind of stay vertical, and that helps with when some of these storms come in. Another option is just to cut the plant either after flowering or before, depending on kind of your own, like if it's in a spot where it needs to be cut, it just needs to be cut. And so then it either is before flowering or after. And again, one of the things I've learned through my own experiments is as I had this exact problem, the same thing, they're growing too tall, they fell over, they're taking up too much space. So I had to cut them. I had to cut them early. And what I learned was not all, but certain plants like New England aster and bee balm, I cut them early, and what it did was it actually shortened the plant. I got a lot more flowers, and it was a more mounded flower instead of a tall flower. So like I said, it doesn't do it for all of them, and it has to have kind of the right timing to cut. But like I said, many times already, is just kind of do what you need to do in your own area, in your own yard. Just the more planning you do ahead of time, knowing the height of the plant and where you're going to put it really helps. So they're going to tip over, whether it's going to be in summer or, in winter when all that snow kind of weighs it down. Just kind of pay attention to that early on.
Okay, that's super interesting. Honestly, I wouldn't mind having like a little forest of like 8 foot tall pollinator plants. I low-key would love that. And probably in the back of my yard.
Yes.
So I know it's pretty common for people to clean up their gardens in the fall at the end of the growing season. That way they can have like a fresh start next spring. I know that's something I see a lot, or else they'll clean it up in the spring right when the snow is done melting. Do you have any best practices for spring and fall maintenance of the pollinator gardens?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of things here that we can mimic in nature that we think we need to do as humans and so like in your yard, one of the things you can do is you can leave the leaves. You've probably seen this campaign on a couple different things. So our deciduous trees here in Wisconsin, they shed their leaves in fall and they grow new ones in the spring. When they do this, the tree is losing about 70% of its nitrogen in those leaves that get stored in the leaves and then are kind of resting on the ground. And they do this so then, as the leaf degrades, it comes back into the soil and back into the tree. If people are moving those leaves, not only are they kind of removing the habitat for pollinators, but they're also taking away, those vital nutrients for the trees. So I would just kind of just increase that awareness. And then, like I was saying earlier, there's a ton of organisms and invertebrates that use those leaves as food and habitat. There's a lot of butterflies in Wisconsin, for example, that will actually overwinter in leaves either as eggs, caterpillars, pupa, or even butterflies, believe it or not. They will overwinter in leaves. And so if you get a really thick layer of leaves in your yard and you're like, I just can't leave those and it really smothers my lawn, something you could do is just move those leaves to your garden bed. Or something I do too is I push the leaves closer to the trees, and so just kind of concentrate them in certain spots in my yard. So then it allows the organisms that are in there to just kind of rest instead of removing them entirely from my site.
Okay. So don't view the leaves as a nuisance, but rather as like a free nutrient source for your gardens.
Yeah, and many gardeners, it's like gold. Leaf mold is gold to them. So it really is great for your gardens, and it's really great to kind of keep it around as long as you can. Like I said, not even talking about the pollinators, the tree stores nutrients in those leaves, assuming that it will be able to take them up again through the soil. And so when you remove those nutrients from your yard, and that's why people end up putting a lot of they replace that with fertilizers and all this other stuff. So why do that? Why spend the money? Just let the tree do it itself.
Exactly.
And I think kind of to add to the leave the leaves thing, I think it's like you're saying, it's common for folks to clean up their garden in the fall. It kind of depends, again, on your own goals and aesthetics. But I really would challenge you to try to wait until spring to clean up your garden. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of organisms that use your plants that you don't realize. And there are a lot of native bees and other invertebrates that will overwinter in plants and in stems. And so if you can kind of wait a little bit until spring, then it allows those organisms to kind of stick around. And so you just kind of wait until spring to remove it. One of the things when we're talking about, instead of like kind of shifting here from cleanup to planting, this is not like a hard and fast rule, but these are kind of easy dates to remember. Is when you're planting or transplanting your plants, and you live here in Wisconsin. I think the dates that I use are Memorial Day and Labor Day. So if you're doing stuff before Memorial Day or after Labor Day, it's usually a pretty good time. So it's like kind of the cooler season. Things aren't really going yet. There's a lot less stress on the plants when you're moving them or planting them. If you're doing stuff in between those dates, like Memorial Day and Labor Day, that's a really stressful time because the plants are really actively growing, and you certainly can plant, and you can certainly move during those times. They just require a lot more hand holding, so to speak, to keep them cool, keep them watered. It's kind of a big shock. And like I said, it's not a hard and fast rule. They're just easy dates to remember. Like last year, our May was really different with the drought and the heat and stuff, and so they were a little more stressed earlier on than before, but it's just like some good dates that I use in my own practices.
Okay. There's a lot of like little things to think about with the pollinator garden. So I'm really happy you're sharing all of this with us today.
Yeah, and I think I want to add quick too, when it comes to natives and just like what you traditionally think about gardens is everybody thinks, oh, spring, let's do everything in spring. Spring is a great time. And it really is. But I would say fall is also a really great time for native plants, especially for planting. You know, fall is a time when a lot of native plants are shifting all their resources back down to their roots. They're already starting to go dormant. So when you move plants in fall or you plant them for the first time, and you plant them in fall, like September, October, that's a really great time. The plants don't look as like maybe as strong or as vibrant, you know, above ground, but it really is a good time. And a lot of times when you go to the nursery at that time of the year, they're trying to get rid of a ton of stuff because they look bad, but it doesn't mean that they're not healthy. They're just already starting to go dormant for the year. So a lot of times in my yard or in the gardening I do, and even for the city with some of the planting we do, I like to focus on fall because it's a lot less stressful on the plant and it requires a lot less maintenance. You don't have to water them as much because they're not really, you know, heading into the growing season. They're heading out of the growing season. So they're starting to sleep versus starting to wake up.
Okay, got it. So we've really been focusing in on this pollinator garden, but I also know there's some things we can add to our yards in addition to the garden that will really help us to create that well-rounded pollinator paradise. Can you tell us a couple other things we could consider adding to our yard?
Yeah, I think, aside, just like us, aside from plants for food and habitat and all that stuff, we need water. So do pollinators. Pollinators need water. So it can be as simple as adding, little plant saucers or little things that gather water in your yard for them to go for. And then, like, another thing I think is easily overlooked is the importance of trees and shrubs. So trees and shrubs are really vital in many life cycles of many organisms, wildlife, and pollinators. And often in spring, the earliest things to flower are trees and shrubs, like apples and cherries, redbuds, serviceberries. And for example, there are studies out there that show for agricultural fields, if they have hedgerows between their fields, they have much, much higher pollination rates, which means they have a lot more successful crops. So I think people may not think of trees and shrubs initially as, something to benefit butterflies or pollinators, but they really do. It's something special we're doing this year in honor of Arbor Day. We're giving away free pollinator-friendly tree and shrub seedlings. So if you,
exciting.
Yeah, if you, so exclusive. If you're listening to this, you can email us the keyword seedling to forestry@cityofsunprairie.com. You can get a free white oak or a free American hazelnut seedling while supplies last.
I love that. So our city's giving out free seedlings for our residents. Come get yours today, add it to your yard, and you'll be putting in one more thing that will benefit our pollinators.
Yeah.
Oh, so cool. Love that you guys are doing this. So now, based on our conversation, I feel equipped to put in a pollinator garden, which I can't do right now because I'm living in an apartment, but I will be ready for when I have my own yard. So now I kind of want to move into the next part of this episode, which is resources. So do you have any resources that you found the most helpful when you were establishing your own pollinator garden?
Yeah, so there's a lot of information out there and there's a lot of places you can go. And so kind of when it came down to the places that I go to the most often, that includes the Xerces Society's website. That's Xerces with an Xerces. They are an invertebrate conservation organization. They push out a ton of really great science and a lot of publications and a lot of easily understood things of here are species for your yard that you can expect to see, or here are things you should plant for your region. So I would just go to their website, xerces.org, and you can find all sorts of stuff. And another thing here in Sun Prairie, we're really lucky to have the University of Wisconsin and also UW Extension really close to us. They're also pushing out a ton of great material on pollinators, especially specific to Wisconsin and plants. So I would check out their website as well. That's pollinators.wisc.edu. When it comes to kind of like I was talking about before, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of stuff to kind of sift through. And these are two resources that they do the scientific rigor to figure it out, and they try to give people the best recommendations for their area. So these are really great resources.
I've definitely come across both of these in my personal research, so I will second that. I think one last thing we should talk about is our neighbors. So majority of us do have neighbors, and not everyone feels the same way about pollinator gardens and yard appearances. I know you and me are pretty aligned right now. I would love to have a very messy pollinator garden in my yard. I still want to come tour your garden someday. But there's other people who prefer a manicured lawn and very tidy flower beds. So if you were someone who wanted to start implementing a pollinator garden or kind of allowing your yard to go a bit more natural, how can we most effectively communicate our conservation intentions to our neighbors?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and being in a neighborhood and having, all sorts of folks around you is to kind of be aware of who's around you and what you're doing. And the easiest thing you can do is put up a sign. You can buy a lot of signs out there. They come in some of the places that you kind of buy these native plants. Is put up a sign that shows your neighbors what you're doing is intentional. You mean to do this, kind of like Prairie in Progress, or Pollinator Way Station, Monarch Way Station, Wildlife Habitat. So when people see this area in your yard that doesn't look what they expect it to look like, and there's a sign there, that increases that awareness, so that they know what it is. And I think a lot of people are just curious. They want to know. They haven't seen stuff like this before. So knowing that you're doing it on purpose, I think, goes a really long way. And I can tell you, I'm on a corner lot, and I'm outside all the time during the growing season. And so I end up talking to a lot of my neighbors because I'm out there all the time, and I'm on their like regular walking route and that kind of stuff. And after like the 10th time, they finally talk to me. They finally ask me the questions because they've seen me every day for the last 10 days or whatever. And I've had some really great conversations because they're like, what is that? Or what are you doing? But I would say like, they've all been really great conversations, and it's just very new to people to see landscapes like this, and they just don't know, and I think they're just curious, and like I said, I've had way more positive comments than I was ever expecting. I've been very nervous throughout the whole process of like, oh, I don't know, this is new, not a ton of my other neighbors are doing what I'm doing, but like I said, I have been overwhelmed by the positive response in my own yard and my own neighbors, and then they kind of check on me now and then. They're like, oh, what do you see this year? Planting anything new? And so I would encourage everyone, if you're interested or kind of looking for that last push, if I should do it, if I shouldn't, you should do it. Like, really, if you build it, they will come, I promise.
Let's put that on t-shirts.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining today. You have shared so much of your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it. I feel ready to make a plan for a pollinator garden. I'm sure our listeners feel ready. As always, feel free to check the show notes for the resources mentioned in this episode. And if you have any questions at all, you can always reach out to us at sunprairiepodcast@cityofsunprairie.com. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Cindy, and happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Thank you for listening to Sustainable Sun Prairie with your host, Rose Daly. I hope you enjoyed this episode and uncovered something new about sustainability. As always, you can subscribe to our podcast and listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and you can listen live on 103.5 FM The Sun, WLSP-LP, and on demand on the Sun Prairie Media Center app. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our contact info, please visit the show notes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.